This emerged out of the fear of Black people from slavery, that there was this massive fear about these slave revolts, Black people demanding their freedom, being willing to have an uprising to gain their freedom. And what that meant then was that you had this language of, we've got to keep this ferocious monster in chains. And you saw with each revolt, with each uprising, a series of statutes being put in place to say that African American, that the enslaved, that Black people could not own weapons, that they could not have access to weapons. And you also saw the rise and the structure of slave patrols and militias that were there and designed to contain that Black population. As the nation began to develop, as you had this war of independence, there was this fear of arming Black people, the fear that even free Blacks who were armed would provide a kind of sense of what freedom looked like to the enslaved. But the exigencies of war required that arming, required having Black folks in the Continental Army. But as the nation developed after that war, one of the things that you had happening was with the Constitution, with the drafting of the Constitution, because the militias themselves had proven so untrustworthy, unreliable as a force to fight against the British invasion, that James Madison, in drafting the Constitution, had language in there that you would have federal control of the militias. Well, when the Constitution went up for ratification to the states, by the time it got to Virginia, the anti-federalists in Virginia were in an uproar. George Mason and Patrick Henry were thinking about this militia being under the control of the federal government. They were like, we will be left defenseless. We cannot trust the federal government that has these folks from Pennsylvania and these folks from Massachusetts to be willing to engage the militia when the slaves revolt. We cannot trust the federal government to protect us. We will be left defenseless. And they began to demand a Bill of Rights that would provide protection, that would curtail federal power. And they began to demand as well a new constitutional convention. That threat of what that meant sent James Madison into the first Congress determined to write a Bill of Rights.
When a democracy becomes more obsessed with controlling Black progress than expanding human rights. What happens when leaders like Donald Trump use fear, lies, and white grievance to stir up division? According to historian and author Carol Anderson, what is happening in America is not new. It is just louder. In today's video, we explore what Carol Anderson has said about Trump's leadership, voter suppression, and the deep injustice Black people continue to face in the so-called land of the free. Watch and pay attention, and I will share my thought later.
Well, that dissent, that would short circuit that movement for a new constitutional convention. And we've already seen what the power of the South has meant in terms of when the Constitution was being drafted itself, how the South said that we will not sign on to become part of this United States of America if we don't get the 3/5 clause, if we don't get 20 additional years on the Atlantic slave trade, if we don't get a fugitive slave clause. And so the South had already wielded its power in terms of being willing to scuttle the United States of America. And Madison believed strongly that this threat coming out of the anti-federalists in the South, out of Virginia, would do the same thing. And that becomes the basis for this Second Amendment.
And can you talk about all of the players? I mean, you just mentioned James Madison, Patrick Henry, the slave states, and how this country came together based on this terror of slaves rebelling, enslaved people rebelling.
the enslaved people rebelling, and that fear that, so you have George Washington, who is a slave owner, who brings, in fact, some of his enslaved people to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. You have Thomas Jefferson, who is not there, but he is writing into Madison, and Madison is writing to him. And one of the things that Jefferson is concerned about is slavery, is the way that it will be depicted. And so you have this silence. There's a silence in the Constitution. It's hovering over the formation of the Constitution, like Banquo's ghost, haunting it, shaping it, but not being explicitly said. But it is the power that is creating this sophistry, this really weird, we believe in freedom and equality, but we want 20 additional years in the Atlantic slave trade. What they said in South Carolina was that South Carolina would be just a backward place. Our wealth comes from the Negroes. That is our natural resource, and we must protect it at all cost. So this is what is the part of the tectonic plates moving at this time in this founding of this nation.
Professor Anderson, could you also explain the significance of the Uniform Militia Act of 1792 and its role in ensuring that weapons and guns remained in the hands of white people?
Yes, and so one of the first laws passed by Congress was the Uniform Militia Act of 1792. What it said was that all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 45 would have to be part of the militia. And so here in the law, it is specifying white men. And it said that they must own a gun. This is part of, the militia is part of citizenship. It is how you give your service to the nation, how you provide your bona fides, as it were, as an American citizen. And so white men are the definition of American citizen in this framing, and that they must own a gun. And so what you see here is that the militia is given this high status in terms of what it means to be able to control an unruly population, what is seen as a dangerous population. And interestingly enough, I'm sorry. Interestingly enough for me is that we have had a Shays Rebellion that happened right before the Constitutional Convention, where white men gathered together to attack the government because they didn't like a taxation policy, and that the militia would not put down these white men. In fact, you had members of the militia joining this rebellion. And you had to have Boston merchants basically finance a mercenary army to put down Shays Rebellion. But what you didn't see coming out of that was a law saying, white men with arms are dangerous. White men with arms attack the government. So we need to ban white men from having access to weapons. You don't see that happening, but you do see that happening with slave revolts. You see the language, the laws coming in place saying they shall not have access, black people shall not have access to weapons, and that the militia and the slave patrol are there to ensure that black people do not have access to weapons.
And Professor Anderson, it seems, you begin your book by talking about the police murders of Philando Castile as well as Alton Sterling. And you point out that the NRA did not come to their defense, despite the fact that they were also killed for having guns in their possession. Whereas in a comparable violence perpetrated by whites, mass violence, the NRA immediately leapt to the defense of the people responsible for that violence, who were white men.
Absolutely. And so there was basic silence on Philando Castile. There was nothing said about Alton Sterling. And what was said about Philando Castile from the NRA was, and this was only after being pushed by their African American members, was that we believe that everyone, regardless of race, sexual orientation, should have access to guns, to arms. But nothing really substantive. What happened after Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, with the Branch Davidian, was that Wayne LaPierre called out federal officers as being jackbooted government thugs who believe they have the right to storm into people's homes and take their guns and kill law-abiding citizens. Federal officers had been killed in those events. And so to then label the response as jackbooted thugs when you get silence with Philando Castile, it really led me to, as journalists were asking, don't African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And that's what sent me down this path all the way to the 17th century to be able to answer that question.
So let's go back to 2016, and this you write in your book, Carol Anderson, about how this inspired you to write this whole book. The immediate aftermath of the police shooting of Philando Castile was broadcast live on Facebook by his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, who's speaking in the car next to her dying boyfriend as a police officer continues to point the gun into the car. Her little child is in the back seat. A warning to our viewers, the content is deeply disturbing.
They killed my boyfriend. He's licensed. He's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm.
So dashcam video released nearly a year later shows the 4-year-old daughter of Diamond Reynolds consoling her heartbroken mother, who's handcuffed in the back of a police squad car minutes after the St. Anthony police officer, Geronimo Yanez, shot and killed Philando.
Get shielded. Okay, give me a kiss. My phone just died, that's all. I can keep it safe. It's okay, I got it, okay? Come here. I can't believe they just did that.
There we hear the crying of Diamond's daughter. The video was released just days after the police officer, Geronimo Yanez, was acquitted of manslaughter. I wanted to ask you, Carol Anderson, to take us on that journey that you took, experiencing all of this, taking it in, telling us who Philando was, talking about the fact that he had a gun, legally had a gun, and told the police officer about it. In fact, had told his mother before, I'm thinking of not carrying the gun, though it's legal, because of, just the day before, another African-American man, Alton Sterling, had been killed by police in Louisiana. But you take us on this journey that led to this book.
Yes, and so it was the killing of Philando Castile. I start off the book going, it was like a snuff film, because we all saw that video image, and it was horrific. It was jarring. And to then get the backstory that this was a man who followed NRA guidelines, letting the officer know that I have a license to carry weapon with me. You have asked for my ID. I am reaching for my ID. And the officer begins to shoot. So he is killed because he has a weapon, not that he is brandishing the weapon, not that he is threatening anyone. He simply has a weapon. And that really led me to begin on this journey as I saw the NRA's virtual silence on this, on this journey to figure out, do African Americans have Second Amendment rights? You know, we're in this moment where the Second Amendment is like hallowed ground. It is sacred. It is one of those things that has been defined as the bedrock of citizenship. And so I started looking. And as I went on this journey, what I saw was that it wasn't about guns. It was about the fear of Black people. It was about the fear of Blackness. It was about the societal labeling of Black people as dangerous, as a threat to whites, and that this architecture comes in place in order to contain this Black population, in order to provide security and safety to the white community from this fear of Black people. And you get this really weird matrix happening where Black people are feared but needed. And so it is how do we contain them? How do we snuff out their quest for freedom? How do we snuff out their quest for their basic human rights, while also keeping them as labor without rights? How do we do that? How do we make that subjugation happen? How do we talk about, in this land of the United States of America, how do we talk about freedom, but try to keep it contained from this Black population? We don't want them getting the ether that we're talking about in this revolutionary moment about freedom and democracy and justice. We don't want them hearing the words about equality. How do we do that? And when there was a revolt in Virginia in 1800 with Gabriel, and Gabriel had fed on the language, the revolutionary language from the United States, from the French Revolution, and from the Haitian Revolution. That sent shockwaves throughout the United States. And Virginia was trembling at the expansiveness of Gabriel's revolt. And the response was, you know, the wrong people are getting the word about freedom and democracy. The wrong people are hearing this revolutionary language and thinking that it applies to them. So this was the journey that I was on to hear and to get into this milieu of how frightening, how dangerous Black people were seen as, and then to follow it all the way through to the 21st century by looking at, do Black people have the right to bear arms? Do they have the right to a well-regulated militia? Do they have the right to self-defense? And seeing how in each of those it has been used against Black people. And that the legal status of Black folk has not altered that significantly. So whether enslaved, whether free Black, whether denizen, which was that halfway limbo land between enslaved and citizen, whether newly emancipated freed people, whether Jim Crow Black, or whether post-civil rights African American. The right to bear arms, the right to a well-regulated militia, and the right to self-defense are in fact fractured. That citizenship is fractured. It is hobbled by this intense anti-Blackness, this fear of Black people, this sense of Black people as a danger to white American society.
So, Professor Anderson, could you talk about that, in particular, the role of Black militias, which you talk about in the book, their role in the early 19th century, to what use they were deployed, and then how it is that whites stripped Black militias of their official standing?
Yes, and so in Louisiana, when it was still the Louisiana Territory. It was before the U.S. had purchased it, but it was on its way. It was on its way. You had a well-heeled, well-trained Black militia that had been very effective. Well, as the U.S. came in, one of the first cries coming out of white New Orleans was to strip the Black militia, disband the Black militia. Well, the governor, William Claiborne, at the time, at first he's like, yes, asking for more arms because we have all of these free Blacks and we've got these Black folks with arms. And so he's asking for more arms from the federal government. But then he starts noticing how effective this Black militia is. And so he tries to square the circle. White fear and the sense that the Black militia is the only real effective fighting force there, given all of the challenges that are happening in that territory at the time. And so what he comes up with is to remove the Black officer class from this Black militia and put in white officers, thinking that that will be enough for whites in New Orleans who want the Black militia disbanded. But then there is a massive, massive slave revolt coming from Charles Deslandes. And this massive slave revolt that included somewhere between 150 to 500 people headed to New Orleans, headed to what they believed was freedom, just sent terror through what is called the German coast of Louisiana. And so William Claiborne, seeing this massive movement, this massive slave revolt, in fact, begins to enlist the Black militia as part of the forces to take on this slave revolt. And the slave revolt is crushed. The U.S. Army comes in, the U.S. Navy comes in. You have the white militia that is there, but the Black militia is very effective. And so you have a Black militia fighting against Black folk who are enslaved and trying to be free. The reward that the Black militia received for this was a further push to be disbanded, further push to not have access to be able to purchase arms. They put a law in place that folks of color, Black people, could not buy arms. Then came the War of 1812, and Andrew Jackson is the leader, the military leader, and he sees the British coming in this Battle of New Orleans. And he sees this Black militia and he's telling Claiborne, we need them. This is an effective fighting force. And Claiborne's like, yes, they are. But I'm telling you, they're just not feeling it right now because of the way we treat them. And he's like, I will treat them equally. I will treat them with the honor that all soldiers should have, and they will be paid equal to whites. They will receive the same pay. And besides the Black militia, I want 2 additional battalions. Claiborne came back and said, you can get the Black militia, but getting 2 additional battalions is going to be difficult because whites in this area believe that arming them is arming the enemy. So you have Black folks who are identified as the enemy. And in that fighting force, that force beat the British. It was like 3,000 or so of Andrew Jackson's troops against 8,000 British troops, and they won. And Andrew Jackson was like, wow, I knew you guys were good. I just didn't know how good. But the response, the reaction to that then was to send them off as a labor battalion to work in the swamps that white men didn't want to go into to do the work. So you have this denigration of Black military contributions to the fighting for America. And that was a consistent theme that we saw. So you get this erasure of this history, and this erasure for the men themselves who are doing the fighting, who are being wounded, who are dealing with the loss of their fighting brethren. That has been the sense that Black men under arms they're a threat. And black men who are trained how to use arms, they're really a threat. So they must be disarmed after they have served our purpose.
Professor Anderson, I just wanted to follow up on the term you used, anti-blackness, that you're actually saying that the Second Amendment is not about guns, but it's about anti-blackness. Explain.
Yes, it is about the fear. So, and the best way to do this is to talk about the kind of history that we have about the Second Amendment. We hear the history of the militia about being this really effective fighting force to fend off a foreign invasion and also being there to fend off domestic tyranny. But what they knew at the time was that the militia had proven to be uneven, unreliable in the war of independence, the war for independence. George Washington was beside himself at the lack of reliability of the militias. Sometimes they would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would just take off and run away. It's really difficult to form a battle plan when your fighting force is like, I'm not feeling it today. and it led Gouverneur Morris, who is out of New York and one of the founding fathers, to say to rely upon the militia against a foreign invasion is like to depend upon a broken reed. And so they knew that the militia was really not strong against a professional army. And then there was Shays' Rebellion. What they saw with Shays' Rebellion is that you could not really rely upon the militia in order to deal with an uprising and insurrections against government. You could not rely upon them for that. Where the militia was consistently good was in slave revolts, in crushing slave revolts. And so this is what led George Mason and Patrick Henry to talk about, we must control our militia. We will be left defenseless against its slave revolts if the federal government controls it. And so it is that fear of slave revolts, that fear of Black rebellion, this fear of Blacks as a dangerous population that must be controlled by these militias, that was essential in the drafting of the Second Amendment. When you think about the Bill of Rights, how you've got the right to freedom of the press, how you have no state-sponsored religion, how you have freedom of assembly, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right.
Carol Anderson is a professor of African American Studies at Emory Universities and the best-selling author of books that challenge the core might of American equality. She writes about how America reacts to Black advancement, not with celebration, but with backlash. In her words, white rage does not have to wear white robes or burn crosses. It can be policy built into the very laws that govern this country. Carol Anderson has been vocal about how Donald Trump's presidency intensified racial division and brought white supremacy from the shadows into the spotlight. She argues that Trump was not an accident. It was the result of decades of racist policies and growing white resentment toward Black progress. Anderson points out how Trump attacked voting rights, demonized Black athletes, and called peaceful protesters thugs, all while calling violent white supremacists very fine people. She says his leadership was not about governing, it was about rallying white fear. For Anderson, Trump's rise was not shocking, it was a symptom of America's refusal to deal with the truth about race. In her groundbreaking book, White Rage, Anderson shows that every time Black Americans make progress, whether it is the end of slavery, the civil rights movement, or the election of Barack Obama, there is a powerful white backlash. She writes, the trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement, and that rage does not always look violent. It looks like laws, gerrymandering, school closures, criminal justice bias, and voter ID requirements designed to hold Black people back. It is about how racism operates not just through hate, but through systems, through policies, through denial. Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote, explores how voter suppression, especially after the 2013 gutting of the Voting Rights Act, is used to disenfranchise Black voters. She calls this law Jim Crow 2.0 because they were not about fraud prevention, they are about power. Anderson says Trump's repeated lies about the stolen election were never just about 2020. They were laying the groundwork to discredit black votes and roll back democracy. In the second, Carol Anderson looks at the Second Amendment and how America's obsessions with guns is rooted in fear of black people. She says the right to bear arms was never intended for black Americans, and that today, open carry laws protect white gun owners but justifies police killings of black men holding the same weapons. For Anderson, this is what systemic racism looks like. One law, two Americas, zero justice. So what is the solution? Carol Anderson believes in truth-telling, in naming racism without fear, in voting and protecting the rights to vote, in writing systems, not just reforming them. Thank you for watching, guys. Do not forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.